Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I'll be with you for the next hour. And we are broadcasting on Jagera and Turrbal country. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about lawfare. If you're familiar with the term lawfare, it's usually used by the mining industry to complain about environmentalists using the court system to slow projects, using their right to use those systems that are in place to all the checks and balances on those projects. But there's no doubt that activists do use the courts to slow down mining projects. But one of the things that I am going to be talking about today on the show is that, well, the government and police use the courts to slow down activism, and there's all kinds of ways that they do this, and they get away with it because, one, the legal and court system is extremely inefficient to begin with, and so all we have to do is do it as it is normally, and you have succeeded at restricting protests, making the lives of the people who are caught in that system worse. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this. It's a sort of malleable system. You can do something over here or something over there, some bail conditions, or, you know, keep you on adjourning a court case for whatever reason, or different things like that, because it's very complicated. And also because the media really doesn't pay much attention to what happens in courts and bail conditions and things like that. They're just not interested in it. It's complicated. It doesn't make a good snappy story. Most people out there don't have any experience with the legal system, and so they don't really understand what the court system is like. And so the media just doesn't cover what happens in court unless it's a sufficiently gory crime or sensational crime, and even then you won't hear much about the actual process of the court and how it works. And so no matter what happens, the police seem to get away with it without much kind of scrutiny from the media. But that's why we have independent community media like 4ZZZ, because I'm going to dedicate an hour's show today to looking at a few different court cases, what is theoretically called justice, but really is some kind of immense bureaucratic labyrinth that has the effect possibly intended. Maybe some will say that it's just an accidental effect of slowing down political activism and ensuring people can't do the work that they are trying to do to make the world better. Of course, the big corporations, even if they end up in court, they're just paying lawyers to do it all. They just take a little bit of money, they can write it off as an expense, whereas for activists, often it's ourselves who have to turn up to the court. We're bringing our friends with us, and we're taking time out of work, our paid work, or the work that we're doing to make the world a better place. And so we're going to hear from Hannah Doole about a case that was finally resolved earlier this year after over a year and a half of limbo, and it is a pretty terrible case. It started with a raid on somebody's property, and it involved people going to jail, people being arrested multiple times because of bail conditions and things like that, and then almost all the charges being dropped and people walking away after a year and a half ordeal with the most minor of penalties. And then we're going to hear about two current ongoing cases in Brisbane. well, more than two actually, but two people caught in ongoing cases. One is Margie Pestorius, who has a couple of ongoing matters in the courts, and the other is Dave Sprigg, who has one out at Ipswich Court. And there is one other case going on that I really wanted to cover on the show, but I have been advised by the lawyers involved they don't want anybody talking to the media about it until it's all resolved, because they don't want to prejudice the matter. In other words, you can't criticise the court because the people that work at the court are very sensitive and they might take offence at you criticising what they do and give you a harsher sentence. That is why the lawyers are saying that they don't want people talking about it. But I will mention briefly that in December 2022, a group of people went into Parliament in Queensland and spent 3 minutes chanting environmental slogans to point out the fact that the world is in environmental crisis. And while Parliament does these sort of bizarre rituals of democratic debate and totally ignore the big issues that everybody wants them dealing with, and for those 3 minutes they were charged with disturbing the legislature, which carries quite a serious penalty, and they are still in court. The hearing is set for, I think it's in November, the hearing. So it will be 2 years by the time they finally make it to court. One of them has, for bizarre reasons that nobody other than a lawyer could understand, has been separated and has been found guilty and has been fined an extremely large amount of money. In fact, much more than the prosecution asked for, $5,000 fine. And so it's an ongoing matter. I'd like to cover it one day because it is a bizarre saga, that one. But under legal instruction, I'm not going to talk about it much on the show. But fortunately, there's plenty of other examples, and so we won't be short of them. And I spoke this morning with Hannah Doole about her recent experiences in the courts. Let's have a listen.
Hey, I'm Hannah, and I've been doing Blockade Australia activism for the last little bit.
And you've recently been in court, but not for a recent incident. It was to do with quite a high-profile raid that took place at your house 2 years ago, and it's been ongoing. And today on Paradigm Shift, we are talking about state lawfare against activists. So I'm interested in the story of this 2-year saga. But shall we start at the very beginning, and can you tell us briefly the details of your arrest and charge?
Yeah, it was 2 years ago now that it all happened. And people might have heard through the news about the big Colo raid where a couple of surveillance operatives in full body camouflage, faces covered, guns and cameras were spotted hiding in the bushes, surveilling some activists that were preparing to do a week of protest in Sydney. And when those people were spotted, they didn't identify themselves as police, so there was a bit of a kerfuffle that ensued of trying to identify who these people were before they fled in an unmarked car. And at the end of that day, there was, I think, 9 people arrested for a whole range of charges that were pretty freaking serious. The cumulative total of maximum penalty for the charges was something like 35 years for a lot of the people that ended up getting arrested. There was charges like intimidate police, assault police, hinder police, and the really nasty one was a fray, which is this sort of group fear and violence sort of charge. Is a bit complicated. Which carried a 10-year maximum penalty.
It's basically meant for riots, is what a fray is, right?
Yeah.
But yes, a riot is very different to having 2 people turn up at your house to spy on you and then demanding to know why they're there. They're 2 separate things. Yeah,
that was our take on the matter. And at the time, I was thinking, well, these guys are not going to get away with that. That's freaking outrageous. And they've just been uncovered doing the dodgiest stuff. Of course, forgetting that there'd be a total media blackout on any sort of activist take on things. And so then we had the New South Wales Police, saying that those people feared for their lives. And the total media groundswell was about how dangerous the activists had been and how the police were put at risk by their behaviour.
So there was a number of you charged, arrested that day and charged, as you said, with these serious charges. And there were other people arrested in the ensuing days, like in other places, say, that the police were chasing up as well?
Yeah, there was at least one arrest that happened at a pub, and I think one or two people were taken off the streets like during the actual protest that happened the following week. So they had, I suppose, a list of people that they were going for, but there was also a degree of randomness of, the people that they did pick up, and a lot of the people that they picked up ended up having their charges dropped when it was shown later that they, in the police's own evidence, just weren't there.
And 2 people were held in custody for several weeks after this without having been found guilty of anything, and their charges were later dropped, is that right?
Yeah, so both the people that were denied magistrate's bail and spent weeks in custody, were shown to have not been there or involved in any of the events that the police described. So, it's a complete miscarriage of justice there. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, so just to summarise, you're planning to do these protests. The police don't want you to do a protest, and so they've gone, raided your house. They've arrested 2 people and refused them bail and held them in prison for the whole time, who later had their charges dropped. And the rest of you are all facing court and put on quite restrictive bail conditions as well. Yeah,
that's right. Those bail conditions lasted for close to 2 years, with at every court attendance the police just asking for an adjournment and not providing any evidence. They didn't deliver the evidence package for most of us. Most of us didn't get an evidence package at all, actually, that was like specific to us, and any evidence that did come just came so late in the piece that it was extremely obvious that every court date the police were using the courts to using the bureaucracy to delay and to keep us on bail, because we're in a much weaker position while being held on bail.
What were the bail conditions that you were put on?
Initially, the bail conditions were weekly reporting to reside at a specific address, non-association with a list of about 20 people, over 20 people. And they did change a few times over the months, so I can't say the exact sequence, but there was other things in there like to not incite or procure people to participate in unlawful protest activity, to not be a part of Blockade Australia or to not look at this Blockade Australia socials, and also these enforcement conditions of to have to show police your phone or your technology if they requested that, to actually have to unlock it for them. And one of the worst ones was being banned from using any encrypted messaging apps or any encrypted apps at all, which is incredibly vague. An extensive list of, most of the software that we all use every day.
And there were people arrested in the course of this long court case for breach of bail for extremely minor things, is that right?
Yeah, actually, I was one of those people, come to think. The be of good behaviour was the condition that they established that I'd broken, which is, it just shows like what a good tool it is to keep people out of political acts if you're constantly afraid, they'll pick me up for this other thing because I'm an easy target because of these conditions that they're holding me on, which they're able to do by just, pushing the can down the road every 6 months and asking for another adjournment.
And now, police obviously have their own tactics they want to slow down protests by, and they're doing these things. But what about the court? Did the magistrate get upset the fact that this court case was dragging on? There was no evidence being presented each time. There was just being adjournments asked for. What was the court process like? Yeah,
I didn't ever feel that there was that degree of personal interest in the case from any of the magistrates. It got shifted around between 3 or 4 courts. It got taken to the DPP to try and put a case forward, so then it was in the district court for a time, but they ended up rejecting it and sending it back to the local court. So I don't think, the system's so big, it wasn't just like in a small town where the same magistrate's always going, okay, this is enough of this, guys. I think they really use the fact that, it's a big city and there's so much going on, there's so many cases through the court every day that it can kind of just slip under the radar as another, okay, we'll deal with that another day.
And so you were finally dealt with, and I take it you were the last of all the people that were charged that day to have their time in court?
Yeah, so I think it was in February that we had our final hearing, our sentencing. At that time, there was 5 of us, so there'd been about 7 that had been either already been through court. I think 2 had already been through court, and maybe 5 or so had their charges completely dropped. And then on February, another person had their charges completely dropped, so it was just 4 of us that went to sentencing.
And what was the end result in court?
I believe all 4 of us got a conditional release order, which in New South Wales is like the lowest level good behaviour bond you can get. I think I was one of the only that had a conviction recorded as part of that. And the conditional release order went for 6 months, which is just like such an irony considering that the bail had, spent nearly or over 3 times that.
Yeah. And so after all of that, after all these charges, court appearances and everything, the end result was just a good behaviour bond, like the most simple punishment.
Yeah, that was because the most significant charges were all dropped, and by the end there was just like one extremely minor charge, which was obstruct police, which we ended up pleading guilty to.
So how has this affected your ability to do activism?
I'd often heard about people talking about the effects of being on bail, and it was very abstract to me. I hadn't actually understood it very much, but the experience of being on bail for that long is like quite extreme, just in how frequently these thoughts would pop up in your mind of, am I allowed to be here? Will the police be in this sort of area? What's my response in this sort of situation? Like the experience of being scrutinised and surveilled and in this sort of, really precarious legal situation was pretty full on for me and lasted a very long time, and in a time when, of course, like any other time, it's really important to be doing political action. So that was a very difficult thing to manage.
And I mean, a couple of people literally were sent to jail for weeks for this. What's been the effects for them? Have there been more personal, effects for them from this process? Yeah,
I think the experience of being incarcerated was pretty extreme, and also some pretty dodgy treatment in there, which I won't go into on their behalf. But the fact that those people also had their charges completely dropped, it was just a very obvious, easy attack for the police to make that I think did have pretty significant impacts on people.
So I guess one of the things in this show, I'm talking to different people about their experiences in court of these cases dragging on. In your case, did you feel like it was just kind of incompetence that meant that this court case went on and on and on, and eventually most of the charges were all dropped? Or do you feel like this is an intentional tactic of using the court process to restrict activists?
I reckon there's definitely a combo. Largely, I think it was an intentional process. I think the period of time when there was that surveillance, there was that raid and the arrests were made, Blockade Australia was, experienced a lot of repression from police, and I think that they're very clued on to how useful bail can be as part of that. So it being like a calculated tactic on their behalf, I think is very reasonable assumption. The fact that so many of the bail conditions were to prevent people from engaging politically, like the non-associations in particular, as well as the ban from using encrypted apps. Those are obviously very targeted to stop people from organising and maintaining a political network. I think there is also a definite degree of incompetence and the sort of passing over of the mistake of, oh, whoops, we've arrested all these people and don't actually have evidence for the charges, or we'll hand that over to the next guy, or we won't come up with anything yet. So I think both things play their own part.
Yeah, and of course the other side of it is that there's other people that are in the legal system that are facing all this kind of thing, and while it's in the advantage of police to have this system be so bad so they can keep people on bail, it keeps making the legal system worse and more kind of cruel to people that are caught in it, whether they're activists or not.
Yeah, the legal system could be more efficient and then people would suffer less, but it also could be less punitive and then people would suffer less. So it's definitely not an isolated experience for activists to have a hard time going through the courts.
All right, thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Andy.
We've just been chatting with Hannah Doole, who is part of Blockade Australia groups, and we're talking about the long saga of her being dragged through court for being at her house when the police turned up there to spy on her, basically. And after multiple arrests, people going to jail, having bail conditions, they couldn't talk to each other, all kinds of things. In the end, they were released with basically nothing, no charges, the smallest punishment you can get, a good behaviour bond. And that's what we're talking about on the show today, is about lawfare by mostly the cops, I think, to a lot of these things, drag people through the courts. The court system is inefficient, not out of malice, I don't think always, just it's inefficient, just out of uselessness and lack of care for the havoc they wreak on people's lives who are caught in that system, because everybody who works in it has a nice job where they sit in air conditioning all day filing paperwork and get paid loads of money, while the other people caught in the system have to cop all the bad bits. But I've got a couple more incidents of lawfare to talk about, and here's one from local activist Margie Pestorius.
I'm Margie Pestorius, and I'm with the crew at Wage Peace, which is a small anti-militarist organisation.
And today we're talking about lawfare by the state against political activists. And so we're going to be talking a little bit with some legal jargon here, because we're forced into this sometimes as activists. But I want to talk to you about a couple of different matters that are currently involving you in the courts. And the first one I want to talk about is about this law remaining at a protest after violence has been committed, that it relates to a protest at the Boeing building in the city. So to start off with, can you tell us briefly what happened at this protest?
Well, we arrived and somebody told a story that managed to mean that the door got opened, and we went in, and some people read poetry, Palestinian poetry, and some people pasted some memorial pictures of people who had been killed on the glass cabinet, which showed Boeing aircraft. And most Boeing aircraft is what we call aircraft for war crimes. It's aircraft and bombs that kill.
And so people have gone inside the Boeing building when they were not invited there, and they've stuck up posters of dead kids on Boeing's glass display.
With poetry, accompanied by beautiful poetry. And then the police came and asked us to move on, and we moved on. And then they came back and charged us about a week later. We got 3 different charges. Some people got willful damage. They were the people who were doing the violence to the property, which was pasting up the paper on the glass. And some people got charged with unlawful assembly, and it was really staying after the violence was added, because that's like what they call an aggravated charge. So some charges they have sort of a basic level 1 charge, and then they have a level 2 charges, which means it's more serious, has a higher sentence, and is aggravated.
So a lot of people have been charged with unlawful assembly in Queensland over the years, but not many since the end of the Bjelke-Petersen government. And this law is pretty bizarre. I've never heard it used before, this instance. Do you want to tell us that it's remaining at a protest after violence has been used?
Well, it's unlawful assembly, and it actually relates to riots. It's a riots charge. So an unlawful assembly is like people have come to a public place, or perhaps it's mostly been used in jails. So where people have assembled in the jail and started to create a ruckus to show that they're very unhappy about something. And it's being used across the country. They're all slightly different. The one in New South Wales is under the Crimes Act. The one here is not under the Crimes Act. But it seems to me that the police have been teaming up to try and get people charged under this. And so people have been charged in Sydney and Melbourne, and they charged the anti-vaxxers with it in 2020-21 in Victoria and New South Wales. And then they've just started charging us with it here.
Where there is, of course, a Public Assembly Act that brought in by the Goss government that's supposed to protect your right to gather. Now, the other thing that happened here is that you were also charged with assault from that day. Did you punch somebody in the head or something?
Yeah, so when you're looking at the video, there's some video of the interview of the lady who was allegedly assaulted, and she says, "Oh well, a lot of people came in the door all of a sudden," and they said, "Was there anybody in particular?" I said, "Oh well, there was one woman, and she said, 'You're very trusting.'" That was me. I said, "You're very trusting." And I walked through the door, and she goes, "And I think somebody pushed past me, and their sort of shoulder brushed against me." And they went, "Oh, your shoulder brushed. Somebody's shoulder brushed against you. That sounds like assault." And she's like, "Really? Oh, well, it wasn't that hard." "Oh, I think it sounds very serious." And so they beat up this is the police doing the interview. So the woman saying, "I don't really know what happened. Some people came into the room. They threw me past the door." That became me being charged with assault.
So we've got these serious charges, assault and remaining at a protest after violence has been committed, from what was a pretty sort of mundane protest, really.
Yes.
But I guess the context here is interesting, is that at that time, it's January of this year, there's been quite a few protests against weapons companies, and this seems like it could be a tactic to try to stop these kind of actions by whacking these really serious charges on something that's a pretty sort of normal protest.
Yeah, so by the 23rd of January, we'd had 4 protests at weapons companies that were significant. The first one was on the 17th of October, and they only charged people about that around this time as well. So the 17th of October at Rheinmetall, and then the 2nd of January at Boeing, then the 8th of January at Ferrer, and then the 16th of January back at Boeing. And in each of them, they had the similar sorts of modus operandi, just with some pasting, or some taking up the space inside the office, or at Ferrer taking up the space inside the factory.
And so the way that you were charged for this was also quite dramatic. You weren't charged at the incident, but they raided your house and a number of other houses in Brisbane several days later.
Yeah, I wasn't charged at any of these actions. I got charged almost all at once with a raid on the 23rd of January, where they came into my house 6:30 in the morning. It was a counter-terrorism squad, 5 plainclothes policemen with guns. They detained everybody in the household. They did 4 simultaneous households. They detained everybody in all those households, and then they took my phone, and they kept saying, "Oh, we're just here to do an investigation," but then they arrested me. They held me in overnight because I refused to sign bail conditions, because the bail conditions they put on the release conditions were so severe that I couldn't sign them.
This is another thing to talk about. So one thing that's been used quite a lot in recent years against protesters is bail conditions that have sort of non-association clauses, and things like that. So what bail conditions were you given?
Actually, I wasn't given any, because I said I wasn't going to sign any. But the young fella that was also arrested around the same time, and the other people also saw their bail conditions, and they were given non-association with any of the co-accused, and not go back to the whole area near the Boeing or Ferrer.
People were also forced to give over their phones to the police for information gathering.
The police had got warrants. So that what was interesting about these actions, they were very sort of minor actions, as I said. They're just like people pasting paper, and we've done it many times before, and speaking poetry in a office space. It's been done dozens of times over the last couple of years, but the police got warrants to come into our houses, and they got a warrant to open my phone. And so I got an extra charge when I refused to give over my phone, because my phone is a private space. Hundreds of private discussions and conversations between me and other activists, and I couldn't, in good conscience, pass over those conversations without those other people's consent.
And you had previously been on bail for a long time for another charge that was this is in New South Wales, another kind of beat up charge for just being a protest, where they then whacked very serious bail conditions on people and it dragged on in court forever. Do you want to briefly tell us about this?
Yeah, so I was wary. One of the reasons I refused to sign bail and said I would refuse is because I had been on bail conditions for 8 months, and that included bail conditions not to associate with 35 different people, bail conditions saying that I had to only have one phone. If the police asked me for that phone, I had to show them what was on it immediately, and that I had to not be in New South Wales, or I had to leave New South Wales. And this had happened to me twice, actually, and again for very minor offences, offences that amounted to, I think, pedestrian obstruct car. It's like a very minor charge, and the other one was being again at an unlawful assembly, which also got dropped, and being at an assembly at King's Wharf in Sydney. So, and that one I had cannot associate with the co-accused. Everyone else had theirs dropped, but I wasn't allowed to associate with the co-accused.
In New South Wales, at other times we have seen bail conditions that instead of giving a list of individuals like you got, it's a list of organisations, and you're not allowed to have any contact with anybody from this organisation, in which case it's explicitly bail conditions to try to stop you doing political activism.
Yeah, or South Australia, they couldn't speak to anybody to do with Extinction Rebellion or go to an Extinction Rebellion planning meeting. It was so broad, and you wouldn't know who was in the organisation, who was not in the organisation.
So I guess these bail conditions, I mean, I've done things about bail conditions before, and you haven't been found guilty when you're on bail, right? You should not be being punished, and they should not be being used to restrict your activities. I mean, it's another story, but in some ways they're just used to repress people and stop them organising. But of course there is also the risk that you can be rearrested, and so you also recently have been charged with breach of bail to do with these bail conditions.
That's right, and so I feel like I'm in a very risky position right now, because if they arrest me for another action or a mobilisation that's coming up, they'll probably hold me while that mobilisation's on, at least, on the basis that I've already breached a bail condition, even though I have not breached the bail condition. I've been very careful not to go to 150 Charlotte Street, where Boeing is, one of the Boeing buildings is at in town. I have been to 123 Albert Street, where there is another Boeing building, but I haven't been to 150 Charlotte Street. I think it's worth saying that in the end, on that morning, they were really trying to stop us going back to the rally on the 24th, the day after the raid, and that was why they had bail conditions. It's to stop you going back to the action. But they didn't even put those in front of the magistrate, because they knew that magistrates would probably not uphold them, and in fact the magistrates just gave us 50 metres, not to go 50 metres to Boeing or 50 metres to Ferrer. But what's interesting is what they've done is I thought they'd made a mistake about how far away I was from Boeing, but that was not the evidence. What the evidence they've given me is a picture of me in a different place with the assertion that I'm at 150 Charlotte Street.
Because what they meant to write as a bail condition is you're not allowed to go to a protest, and you went to a protest. Where it was is irrelevant in the police's eyes. That's not the intended aim of the bail conditions.
That's right. I was at a protest not too far away, but not within the bail condition.
We've got here a use of trumped up charges, we've got a use of bail conditions, we've got a use of kind of police intimidation, of raiding people's houses, and all it seems just to stop people organising protests. At one point in time when a lot of people seemed to be organising protests because it just happened, there was full-on massacres happening in another part of the world. But we're 6 months later on from these actions, and you're still in court.
Yeah.
So dealing with this.
Yeah, we're right at the beginning of all the court processes. It might not seem that we're at the beginning because we have been in court 4 or 5, 6 times for each matter. However, on the basis of it, we're actually at the beginning of the case. So we keep going back to court, and we find out when we get there that they haven't really negotiated the right number of days, the right number of prosecutors, whether we should be on our own, whether we should be separate, whether we should have a different barristers, or all of that seems to get redecided every time. And what I notice is that they all get paid. The judge gets paid, the barristers get paid, the solicitors, the prosecutors, the police. They all get paid, but we don't. And we turn up, we sit around for 3 or 4 hours. We have a group of supporters because we're that sort of people. They all turn up for 3 or 4 hours. None of us get paid. And they don't seem to mind that it's a shambles. And it is a total shambles.
Has it had effect on your ability to do political organising?
Yeah, it has. I don't like to say that. I'd like to say, no, it hasn't. But it has. There's been about 10 actions at Boeing and FERA that I have not been able to attend directly, and now I'm really worried about the breach of bail because 4 police officers have conspired to lie about where I was in that photo, and the magistrate had just said, "Oh, just litigate it well, you'll be all right," which for me means, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 plus a month's back and forwards to court. So yeah, it's annoying. I came back. I was doing a mobilisation in Newcastle. I had to come back to Brisbane for a court case that was one of these sort of court cases that in which nothing happened, where it didn't move forward, where we thought it was just about to move to trial and then didn't move to trial. And then later that week we had the Ryan Mattal one, and exactly the same happened. We thought it was at trial, and they just cancelled the whole thing, started all over again. And at FERA they're going to start all over again and move it back to Brisbane. It's just crazy. It's a shambles. I mean, people should know the court system's a shambles, and my guess is we're not the only ones being affected. That the poor people and people who are in the jail systems, the poor people who are being harassed, Aboriginal people, those people are being probably much more affected by it than we are.
Oh yeah, well, if you're in remand being held and these things are dragging on and on forever, it's the difference between literally your freedom and captivity.
Absolutely, and we see that one thing that's good about going over and over, even though it's horrible, is that you get to see the reality of other people's lives.
All right, well, thanks very much, Margie.
Thanks, Andy.
Here on the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, we've been talking about lawfare, the cops, the government, the court, all using the legal system to tie up people, restrict them from doing political activism that might change things. We were just talking with Margie Pestorius, and I've got one more interview of somebody who is currently being engaged in a bit of lawfare, Dave Sprigg. Let's have a listen to Dave.
I'm David Sprigg. I'm a horticulturalist, and I'm concerned about the weapons industry and how they're supplying weapons to brutal regimes across the world.
And today on the show we're talking about police and the state using lawfare to shut down activism, and you have been in court for the last 6 months or more in a court process. Do you want to start off with telling us first briefly about the protest action that you did that saw you end up in court?
So I went to a weapons factory out in Red Bank called Rheinmetall. They're a German company, and I went up to the main reception and I had some images of West Papuans who had been murdered, and I pasted them on the entrance to the building. And I was forcibly removed. That's what I did.
And initially you weren't arrested or anything like that. The charges came later?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's quite a fair while later. The charges came. Wasn't expecting to be charged. Yeah, who does, for just a week pasting a few sheets of paper to a wall.
What were the charges?
Charges were trespass and willful damage.
And the damage is that you stuck pictures up on the wall?
Yep, that's it.
I'm interested in talking about the court process since then, because, yeah, it's still going now. The action was in October last year, and the court process is still going, and it's been quite a journey. Can you tell us a bit about what it's been like in that court case?
Yeah, so I went there to the factory on the 17th of October last year, and then yes, I received some charges in the mail. They found my co-accused, Sam, and we have appeared in court probably about 5 times. And I travel out to Ipswich to go to the courthouse. And on the 5th of July, I went to court, gathered all my friends to come to court with me for the hearing, thinking that it would all be over. But that didn't happen. The prosecutor said that she needed time to talk to her witnesses. And so for some reason, it seemed like it was completely acceptable for the prosecutor to take the court's time to have a chat with her witnesses. And the hearing didn't go ahead that day for a number of reasons. One is because another police prosecutor said that the court case would go for 1 day, and then when we get there, the magistrate says there's no way it'll take 1 day, it'll take at least 2 days. And she wasn't willing to start the hearing on that day. So I've been told to go back to court in a month's time to set another date for the hearing. So it's been a protracted process that has not been because of my actions but because of others, and they did drop the trespass charge, but yes, I've still got to go back to court.
And you have had previous cases like this that have dragged on a very long time, is that right?
Yeah. I got arrested at Disrupt Land Forces 1 year, and I made about 6 court appearances, and then I turned up for the hearing, and there were no witnesses there, and so the prosecution had no case to put before the magistrate, so they dropped the charge, or they withdrew the charge.
But that was after it had been, a year or something in court?
It was 6 or 7 appearances in court. And that went, I don't know, it was a 9 months or 10, 12 months, I'm not sure exactly. But
part of these, I guess, using these charges, willful damage, things like that, an increase in the severity of charges that are being used, like that, just being there, doing a protest, sticking up a poster, it could be public nuisance. Does it feel like that there is this kind of pursuing of charges, including ones that sometimes drop later on, just to put people in the court system, or to intimidate people out of doing these kind of actions?
Oh, definitely, yeah. These kind of tactics of, overcharging someone, and police like to tell you what the maximum penalty is or something, especially if you're unfamiliar with the law. They do like to scare you, and they also just like to tie you up in the court system. Some police, they really don't care what the outcome is at court. They're just interested in putting you in that system to kind of just take up your time, really.
All right. Thanks very much, Dave. That is Dave Sprigg there, talking about his own experiences in court the other week, turning up with a full legal argument prepared, ready to represent yourself, gee yourself up for a big day in court, only to be told that the prosecution is not ready and the whole thing's going to be adjourned. It's not a great experience, but as we have heard over the course of today's show, that it's not that uncommon an experience that the legal system, through either incompetence or intentionality, has created a shambles that stops people from organising politically, but also stops people from just living their lives, people being dragged again and again into court, facing repressive bail conditions, being wrongly charged, having charges dropped later on, at times being imprisoned and then having charges dropped later on. Yeah, it's a very serious situation, and as I said at the start of the show, one of the other cases that's going on in Brisbane at the moment, I actually was told by the lawyers not to interview anybody about it, and that's ongoing, and by the time it finishes in November, it will be 2 years after a protest that lasted 3 minutes. was people were arrested, and that one's had all kinds of shenanigans in the court process as well. And so it's a common thing. We need to work out what we're going to do about it if police are going to keep charging people with things like this. And one of them is, of course, we need to support activists and have a good community where we can, one, share legal expertise and know-how and connections and things like that, but also just be able to support people to do that work and go through all the ordeal. And I think we also, need to skill up and be prepared. And somehow, I don't know, the cards are stacked against you. When you're in the legal system, you don't have much power over it. But somehow we need to work out how to work around it if people are going to keep doing these kind of actions, which in a time of climate emergency, genocide overseas, all kinds of things, you would think we're going to need to keep on struggling, keep on doing everything that we can. And so let's all work together and work out what we can do. I'll see you next week on The Paradigm Shift.